For 33 years, Judge Douglas Whitaker reigned over the court, powerful, protected, and untouched by scandal. He took money from 7 billionaires, silenced whistleblowers, and believed no one would dare expose him. That is, until a 37-year-old African president walked onto the world stage, exposing this judge's darkest secrets live on television and changing everything. The final proof? A single text message that forced the judge to resign in shame. So, what exactly did that message say, and why did it shake the entire justice system to its core? What truth did Ibrahim Traoré expose that made even the most powerful judge regret and resign? To better understand this story, we must go back to where it all began. For 33 years, Judge Douglas Whitaker sat perched atop the judicial throne, cloaked in silence, shielded by tradition, and elevated by power. In a world where most people shouted to be heard, Whitaker mastered the art of saying nothing, literally. He barely spoke during court sessions. No fiery dissents, no impassioned rulings, just a stone face and a quiet pen. In fact, over 3 decades, courtroom transcripts reveal his total speaking time could be measured in minutes. People joked that Whitaker had taken a vow of legal silence. "He talks less than a mime in a courtroom," one reporter famously quipped. But his influence was deafening. Despite this monk-like discretion, Whitaker's fingerprints were on some of the most consequential decisions in recent memory, rulings that shaped elections, enabled corporate takeovers, and quietly rewrote the balance of power. To the public, he was a mystery in robes. To insiders, he was a fortress, walled off, calculating, and curiously immune to scandal. If silence was his strategy, secrecy was his weapon. Very few people ever saw Whitaker outside his chambers. He rarely attended public events, gave no interviews, and seemed to exist only in the grainy press photos taken during formal court proceedings. Yet, behind that austere facade, decisions kept coming, decisions that always seemed to benefit the same kinds of people: the powerful, the connected, the wealthy. For years no one asked why. It wasn't just deference, it was fear. No one wanted to be the one to ask, how does a man with no outside income afford 3 beach homes? But someone would ask eventually, and when that question finally came, it wouldn't be from a journalist, a watchdog group, or a political opponent. It would come from someone he had never imagined would dare. Whitaker was fond of saying he led a modest life. In fact, those were the very words in his official financial disclosure form for 12 years running. But the numbers told a different story, a very different one. Records later revealed that Whitaker had accepted luxury vacations from no fewer than 7 billionaires, most of them with interest before his court. He'd flown on private jets to Swiss resorts, played exclusive rounds at Pebble Beach, and dined with tech moguls on remote islands where the press couldn't follow. One satirical news segment captured it best. He claimed to be a man of modest means, except his wristwatch cost more than a hospital wing. But it wasn't the vacations alone that raised eyebrows, it was who was paying for them. One of the most frequent benefactors turned out to be a billionaire with deep holdings in West Africa. This same billionaire's mining company had, for years, been accused of exploiting labor and bribing local officials to suppress land rights across Burkina Faso. While those investigations stalled or vanished, Whitaker's court just so happened to rule in favor of trade policies and arbitration clauses that protected foreign interests from being sued by African governments. Coincidence? Some believe so. Others began to wonder if this wasn't just corruption, it was complicity on a global scale. Behind closed doors, deals were struck over vintage wine, and promises were whispered over the clink of expensive dinnerware. Whitaker didn't just accept gifts, he built a quiet empire of favors, obligations, and protections. His benefactors knew they were investing not in a man but in a system. And Whitaker? He knew the one rule that kept him safe: never leave fingerprints. But every empire, no matter how discreet, eventually slips. For decades, the Supreme Court and those who served within it operated under what was proudly called the honor system. Judges were trusted to disclose conflicts, recuse themselves from questionable cases, and maintain a moral compass sharper than the law itself. But there was one problem. There were no real rules, no watchdogs, no audits, no consequences. It was a system designed not for justice but for appearances. Whitaker was its master. He wore the robe, he gave the look of integrity, and he knew exactly how to hide behind the illusion. That illusion shattered the day a cache of internal emails surfaced. The messages, obtained through a leak no one has yet claimed credit for, showed Whitaker using multiple aliases to conduct wire transfers. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, routed through shell companies in Luxembourg, were marked only with vague labels like advisory, consulting, and legacy contributions. The documents didn't just suggest deception, they proved it. One email thread, written under an alias later linked to Whitaker, casually instructed a banker to ensure the origin trail is clean. When investigators cross-referenced dates and signatures, the alias tied directly back to Whitaker's own government travel records. The scandal wasn't just ethical, it was criminal. But this was just the beginning. Because in another country across the ocean, a man named Ibrahim Traoré had already begun connecting the dots. A man who had grown up watching his country's resources vanish into foreign hands, a man who had always wondered who stood behind the court decisions that enabled exploitation, then turned a blind eye, a man who, quietly and methodically, was building a case that would bring the illusion crashing down, not with noise, but with evidence. And one message, one single text, the one mistake Judge Whitaker never thought would surface. But it would, and it would destroy him. When Ibrahim Traoré was elected president of Burkina Faso at just 37 years old, the international press didn't quite know what to make of him. Some called him a transitional leader, others labeled him a temporary figure, and more than a few dismissed him as too young, too bold, too African to last. But Traoré had heard those kinds of whispers before, at military school during his service, and even as he rose through the ranks during his nation's most fragile years. None of it mattered. What did matter was that he had the one thing no amount of money or media training could manufacture: a genuine vision for justice. Viewers watching his first televised address still remember the line that made them lean forward: "Africa doesn't need more speeches. It needs silence to be broken where injustice still lives." That moment set the tone for a presidency unlike anything the continent had seen before. Traoré was not a man of suits and smiles. He preferred military fatigues, books stacked higher than his desk lamp, and unfiltered field reports over sanitized memos. His team joked that he went from boots to ballots faster than most politicians change ties. But it wasn't just speed, it was clarity. From day one, he cut the presidential motorcade in half, sold the third jet, and redirected the funds to building the country's first rural legal aid centers. He made enemies fast, especially among those who had grown wealthy by staying quiet. But he also earned something rarer: trust, the kind of trust that made grandmothers pray for him and young activists name their children after him. When he spoke about imperialism and colonial injustice, he didn't use history as a shield, he used it as fuel. One of his earliest speeches in front of the African Union ended not with applause, but with a stunned silence, then a standing ovation. "Our sovereignty is not a negotiation," he declared, "and if justice lives in other countries' pockets, then we must bankrupt the lie." While many presidents relied on filtered briefings and carefully crafted summaries, Traoré didn't just read the headlines, he devoured the footnotes. Ministers complained that he asked more questions than an auditor. Analysts dreaded handing him reports because he circled numbers in red ink and wrote full paragraphs in the margins. His nickname among staff was l'enquêteur, the investigator, and it wasn't meant as flattery. But it worked because Traoré understood what few world leaders truly grasped. The truth doesn't shout. It hides in small print, buried memos, and quiet patterns no one is supposed to notice. It was in one such report, buried in an annex from an obscure mining oversight committee, that the name Whitaker first appeared. It wasn't even a headline, just a mention: "Court ruling in Washington, D.C. by Judge D. Whitaker enabled continued arbitration protections for foreign investors in Burkina Faso." A legal footnote. A single line. But Traoré saw something else, a pattern. His eyebrow arched slightly, the way it always did when something didn't sit right. He said nothing to his staff, just circled the name and placed the file on his private desk. That night, instead of sleeping, he pulled up archived rulings, political donations, press silence. One by one, the puzzle began to take shape. He didn't know exactly what he was looking at, but he knew this. Someone had been building a wall of silence, and that wall connected to Judge Douglas Whitaker. For Traoré, justice wasn't just policy, it was personal. His earliest memories weren't of flags or classrooms, but of watching his mother being denied medicine at a local clinic because the shipment was redirected. He later learned that redirected meant sold to a foreign buyer at 10 times the price. That same year, he asked her why people in uniforms never stood up for villagers. Her answer stayed with him forever: because sometimes power forgets who gave it permission to exist. That one sentence became the foundation for what would later be called the Traoré Doctrine. The idea that no title, no robe, no office could ever sit above the people it claimed to serve. In private, he wrote the phrase on his wall: "Power must kneel before truth." And so, late one night, he summoned 3 of his most trusted aides: an anti-corruption analyst, a digital forensics expert, and a veteran journalist who'd once been imprisoned for speaking out. Together, they launched Project Clean Justice, a confidential task force with one goal: trace every ruling, every trip, every financial tie linked to Judge Whittaker and those like him. They worked in silence. No leaks, no announcements, just quiet interviews, satellite documents, intercepted banking records, and whistleblower testimonies, stitched together with the precision of surgeons. It was slow, frustrating, risky. But inch by inch, the truth began to form, not as theory but as undeniable fact. And yet, Traoré didn't act, not yet. Because in his mind, justice wasn't a hammer, it was a mirror. And when it finally arrived, it had to show everyone, beyond debate, beyond denial, exactly who this judge had been all along. He didn't want revenge. He wanted the truth to speak so clearly that even silence would be forced to listen. The deeper Project Clean Justice went, the more people began to whisper. "You're poking a bear," one advisor warned Traoré with a tight smile. Traoré just nodded, amused. "Half the room told me not to poke the bear," he told his team later. The other half, they were the bear. It wasn't paranoia, it was fact. The farther they pushed into the digital dust of Whittaker's history, the more mysterious firewalls they found. Layers of encryption, ghost companies, timestamps just minutes apart from ruling announcements. But Traoré's task force wasn't easily intimidated. His forensics expert, nicknamed the Ghost Breaker, began digging through satellite-linked travel data. She found flights paid for in cash, luxury hotels booked under the names of Whittaker's former clerks. Patterns emerged. A speech in Geneva followed by a ruling on international trade law, a retreat in the Seychelles just before a high-profile case was dismissed. Then came the breakthrough, a cloud backup, long forgotten, tied to a private account linked to Whittaker's wife. Inside were years of data, calendars, receipts, photos, and, most damning of all, texts. Hundreds of them. Not all were useful, but enough to sketch a picture of a man who did not simply interpret the law, he negotiated it. In one document, a $50,000 consulting fee was transferred just 2 weeks before Whittaker ruled in favor of a corporate client accused of human rights violations abroad. In another, there were messages from elite donors asking which upcoming cases would be safe to push through. This wasn't influence. This was orchestration, and it was happening at the highest level of global law. Traoré stared at the files one evening, alone in his study, the lamplight flickering across a mountain of evidence. He didn't smile, he didn't celebrate. He whispered just 2 words: "Keep going." It was one thing to find expenses. It was another to hear the judge speak in his own words. At first, the texts were carefully worded, cautious, as if Whittaker knew he might be watched. But over time, especially in threads with his closest lobbyist contacts, the tone grew bolder, darker, and unmistakably entitled. The first text that caught Traoré's breath came from a thread labeled, "Planning Q1 2024. It read, "Don't worry, Traoré will never know who's pulling the strings." The smugness in those words was stunning. It wasn't just dismissive, it was strategic. It revealed a system confident in its invisibility. For a second, Traoré just stared at the screen, not angry, not surprised, just still. But there was more. A trove of texts between Whittaker and a foreign investment consultant showed active coordination about softening legal pressure in African territories, complete with timelines and reward projections. In one message, a donor asked if it was safe to go ahead with land transfers, to which Whittaker responded, "My ruling will take care of it." There it was, direct evidence that a man appointed to protect the highest ideals of justice was shaping rulings based on private negotiations. Traoré didn't need commentary. He didn't need to editorialize. The words were the blade. His job was simply to make sure the world saw where it cut. And then it came, the text that shifted everything. Laid in the chain, buried in a thread between Whittaker and his wife, there it was, casual, cold, and terrifying in its implications. "If we destroy Traoré, the others will stay quiet." The sentence was short, but the silence that followed in the room where it was read lasted nearly a full minute. Traoré's aides didn't speak. The air itself seemed to still. This wasn't just corruption. This was calculated erasure. A plan not only to discredit a leader, but to use him as a warning, to instill fear, to maintain power through threat and example. It was no longer political. It was personal. For the first time, even the most seasoned members of Traoré's circle showed emotion. His advisor, with 30 years in human rights law, pushed back his chair and walked out silently. The journalist assigned to document the findings put down his pen. No one knew what to say because this wasn't a debate. It was evidence of character assassination in motion, designed, executed, and documented by the very man sworn to defend justice. Traoré didn't flinch. He closed the file and simply said, "Then we don't speak. We show." He didn't want Whittaker's apology. He didn't want revenge. He wanted every citizen who had ever been told their truth didn't matter to watch the most powerful judge in the world fall, not from attack but from exposure. Because when truth stands in the light, the shadows have nowhere left to hide. For weeks, Judge Douglas Whitaker had watched quietly from his well-protected perch, certain that the noise around President Ibrahim Traoré's investigation would fade, just like every other attempted scandal had over the past 3 decades. But as the whispers grew louder and Traoré's name started appearing not just in African media, but in global legal circles, Whitaker made a critical error. He stepped out of the shadows. In a rare and explosive statement released through his personal press liaison, Whitaker called Traoré a destabilizing threat to international legal harmony and accused him of leading a dangerous smear campaign against judicial independence. The media pounced. Cable news split into panels. European commentators described Whitaker as finally drawing a line. U.S. pundits nodded approvingly. One analyst even said, "He's being firm, finally, and firm is leadership." But not everyone was impressed. Inside Traoré's Situation Room in Ouagadougou, his advisors exchanged glances as the news broke. One of them, a grizzled communications chief with a reputation for dry humor, leaned back and muttered with a smirk, "He just walked into the lion's den and he's wearing steak cologne." Laughter broke out in the room, but it wasn't just amusement, it was relief. Whitaker had just abandoned the legal high ground. He turned it personal, and when a man with skeletons in his closet opens the door for a fight, he forgets that someone might be waiting just outside with a flashlight. For Traoré, this wasn't arrogance, it was opportunity. The trap wasn't baited, it was already sprung. Within hours, Traoré made his move. At exactly 6 p.m. local time, his press secretary released a short, calm statement to international media. President Traoré will hold a public address tomorrow at 10 a.m. No notes, just the truth. There was no shouting, no dramatic trailer, just the kind of silence that warns before the storm. The internet caught fire. Rumors flew. Was it a speech? A press conference? A formal indictment? No one knew, but everyone, politicians, journalists, whistleblowers, even Whitaker's own staff, began clearing their schedules. The tension stretched across time zones like a live wire. Back in Traoré's office, his team was preparing for every outcome. Security teams doubled. The tech crew rehearsed 3 separate livestream backups. But even with the seriousness of the moment, there was a strange lightness in the air. One aide admitted she was shaking with nerves. Another, with tears in her eyes, asked Traoré if he was sure. He just smiled softly, not boastful but calm, and said, "We won't yell. We won't fight. We'll simply read." That was all. No defense, no spin, just the plan. Hold a mirror up to power and let the world decide what it saw. In those final hours before dawn, the world waited, not for a spectacle but for something rarer, the kind of truth that didn't need to be sold. The morning of the address began with a sky so still, it seemed symbolic. Cameras were already set, reporters filled the hall, millions watched online, some skeptical, some hopeful, all curious. Traoré walked in without notes, without teleprompters, and stood alone at the podium. No music, no entourage, just a quiet room and a single man holding a black folder. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't open with pleasantries. He opened with a sentence. "What I'm about to read was never meant for you to hear." Then he looked down and began. The message was short but history-making. "We must make an example of him. Silence him. That's how you control the others." That was it. One text, 13 words. But when spoken aloud, they shook the room like a thunderclap. Reporters looked up, stunned. Some gasped, others dropped their pens. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the cameras, still rolling, capturing what was no longer a press conference but a reckoning. Goosebumps rippled across viewers at home, in bars, in classrooms, in courtrooms around the world. People sat frozen. What they had just heard wasn't political rhetoric. It was premeditated destruction. An effort to silence a leader, to crush resistance, to protect the illusion of untouchable power. And yet, there Traoré stood, alive, unshaken, and holding the evidence in his hands. The silence after the reading said more than any statement could. In that moment, Judge Douglas Whitaker stopped being the man above the law. He became a man exposed by it. And for the first time in decades, people stopped whispering his name in reverence and started asking, "How much more is there?" Within hours of Traoré's address, the world changed. It didn't shift slowly or subtly, it cracked open like thunder. Outside the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., a crowd gathered with signs, cameras, and voices that hadn't been heard in decades. They weren't angry just for the sake of protest. They were angry because they had finally seen what had been hidden, a system that called itself sacred but operated in the shadows. No more shadows and justice, they shouted over and over as the crowd swelled. Within 3 days, it grew from a few dozen to tens of thousands. Students, lawyers, clergy, even retired judges. They came not just for accountability but for clarity. They wanted to see the ground where one of the highest legal empires had stood, now cracking beneath the weight of truth. Across the globe, news anchors were visibly stunned. "We've never seen a judge fall this fast," said one analyst on live television. "In 48 hours he's gone from untouchable to undefendable." Every major network cleared their programming to cover the unfolding storm. Editorials began shifting in tone. Even papers that once championed Whitaker's prudence now called for an immediate investigation. International leaders, who had previously kept diplomatic distance, issued statements praising Traoré's courage. But inside the walls of the Supreme Court, the tension was palpable. Whitaker had gone silent. For a man who had ruled through stillness, the silence no longer felt powerful, it felt like surrender. On the 4th day, Whitaker finally broke his silence. In a short, written statement delivered through his attorney, he said, "Those texts were private. They prove nothing." The words landed with the grace of a stone dropped in a still pond. Instead of calming the storm, it fed the fire. The public backlash was immediate and ferocious. Social media ignited. The hashtag your words your false surged to the #1 global trend within minutes. People weren't just reposting the quote, they were pairing it with images of corrupt courtrooms, abandoned mining towns in West Africa, and screenshots of decisions that now seemed drenched in collusion. The reaction wasn't just digital. A former clerk of Whitaker gave a live interview, confirming that the judge often dictated rulings with donor calendars in mind. Another whistleblower came forward, a mid-level banking executive who admitted, under oath, that Whitaker's financial patterns matched money laundering algorithms. His defenders, once vocal and loyal, began to vanish. Political allies issued vague statements. Judicial peers retreated into no-comment territory. And behind closed doors, even Whitaker's oldest allies began to whisper the word he had feared for decades: resignation. But the most devastating blow wasn't public opinion, it was evidence. When Traoré returned to the podium one final time, it wasn't for drama, it was for closure. Behind him, a screen lit up with a chart, simple at first but damning in motion. It tracked 14 financial transfers made to accounts linked to Whitaker, each of them connected to offshore shell companies. The lines danced across the screen, each one pointing to a decision rendered by Whitaker's court. And each of those decisions had directly harmed African governments, protected corporate interests, or dismantled environmental protections in regions rich with extractive contracts. In less than 5 minutes, Traoré turned what had been suspicion into surgical clarity. These weren't isolated mistakes, they were patterns. They were investments. They were decisions made not in the name of justice, but in the currency of betrayal. Then came the line, not shouted, not dramatized, just spoken with quiet gravity: "This is not revenge. This is repair." The room fell silent. Viewers at home held their breath. And for once, no one could argue, because what Traoré had just done was not an attack, it was an autopsy. He had shown, with precision and restraint, how a man had built his kingdom on corruption and cloaked it in robes. And he had taken it apart without anger, only resolve. What followed next was inevitable. Resignations, investigations, the slow, humiliating dismantling of everything Whitaker had built over 33 years. And somewhere, in every capital where justice had once been sold behind closed doors, a new warning began to echo: the age of impunity is ending. When the official statement came through, there was no press conference, no final speech, no cameras waiting outside the courthouse. It was one paragraph, posted online at 7:42 a.m. local time. Effective immediately, Justice Douglas Whitaker has submitted his resignation from the Supreme Court. Just like that, 33 years of power ended, not in protest but in quiet collapse. There was no applause, only silence. A heavy, knowing silence across every continent, like the world had exhaled something it didn't know it had been holding in for decades. Reporters stood outside the court, stunned, narrating history as it unfolded, not in fire or fury but in the soft, measured language of accountability. But Whitaker's fall wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a wave. Within a week, 3 other judges, each tied to suspicious financial activities, travel records, or lobbying correspondence, submitted their resignations. None of them had been publicly named yet, but the writing was on the wall, and the wall was no longer theirs to write on. The judiciary, long considered immune to the chaos of politics, was now being forced to reckon with its own reflection. For the first time in a generation, the system wasn't just looking inward, it was cleaning house not to preserve itself but to transform itself. What began as a quiet investigation in a small African office became a legal reckoning that spanned the globe. In Burkina Faso, Parliament passed the Judicial Sunlight Act, a sweeping reform that required all judges to disclose gifts, publish case-related meetings, and undergo annual ethics reviews by independent citizen boards. It was radical, transparent, and instantly copied. 14 nations across Africa, Asia, and South America invited President Ibrahim Traoré to speak on judicial reform, corruption resistance, and the power of moral leadership. In each address, he didn't talk about Whitaker. He talked about systems, cultures, memory. The question isn't who fell, he told one audience in Nairobi. The question is what kept him standing for so long? Even in the West, long resistant to outside moral critique, the shift began. At Harvard Law School, the nation's most elite legal institution, a new course was introduced, required for all incoming students. Its title? The Traoré Standard, Ethics and Global Judicial Power. The curriculum included investigative models, ethics dilemmas, and a full case study on the fall of Douglas Whitaker. Law students debated the lessons of silence, power, and complicity, not as abstract theory but as a real-world warning. Across lecture halls and legislative chambers, one idea began to take root, that justice without sunlight was not justice at all, it was only shadow. Weeks after the resignation, when the cameras had faded and the headlines had cooled, Ibrahim Traoré took a single day off. No press, no speech, no phone calls. He traveled quietly to the edge of Toma, the rural village where he was born. There, in a small mud-brick home with faded curtains and a wooden bench out front, his mother waited. She had watched the events unfold like the rest of the world, not through headlines but through whispered updates from neighbors and the occasional radio broadcast when the signal was strong enough. When he entered the house, she didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him. Then she stood, walked forward, and hugged him tightly, quietly, as if holding back a world's worth of worry. The world may not remember the courtroom, she whispered in his ear, but it will remember the courage. He didn't reply, he didn't need to. Because in that moment, the victory wasn't in the collapse of a judge, or the rewriting of laws, or the echo of international praise. It was in the quiet certainty that something had changed, not just a system but the idea of what justice could be when someone dares to believe that no one, not even the most powerful, is beyond its reach. And sometimes that belief doesn't roar. Sometimes it simply reads. Have you ever felt small in the face of power? Have you ever sat in a room, a courtroom, a meeting, or even your own home, and felt like your voice couldn't possibly matter, like the decisions that shape your life are made in places you'll never be invited into, by people you'll never meet, speaking languages designed to keep you quiet? If you have, then this story was written for you. Because Ibrahim Traoré didn't storm into history with noise or force. He stood up, alone, calm and clear, and spoke the truth, no anger, no vengeance, just facts. And in doing so, he made the walls of power tremble. So ask yourself, what if your truth, calmly spoken, could bring the walls down too? What if you are more powerful than you've been told? Because in the end, this wasn't a story about Burkina Faso, and it wasn't just about Douglas Whitaker. It was about every courtroom where silence was traded for influence, every policy written with invisible ink, every citizen told to trust the system while the system quietly sold them out. But more than that, it was about every person who refused to stay silent, every voice that kept asking, why does no one answer? Every whistleblower, every journalist, every mother who raised a child to believe that dignity matters, even when power forgets it. This story crossed borders because injustice does. But so does courage. So does truth. And now, perhaps more than ever, so does hope. Because sometimes, it only takes one person to read the words no one else dared to read aloud. And let the world finally listen. The character Ibrahim Traoré and all individuals portrayed in this story are entirely fictional and do not represent real people or real-life events. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or deceased, is purely coincidental. This content is created for storytelling and educational purposes under fair use and does not intend to defame or misrepresent any real individuals or institutions. If you found this story powerful, thought-provoking, or inspiring, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because the truth doesn't just change systems, it changes us.